Welcome back, guys. Now, I'm very proud of everyone for getting this far. What you've written up till now is a lot of the fundamental React and Redux code. Much of the patterns that you're writing are pretty much the patterns, 90% of what you will write when building an application. There's 10% where things get more advanced and more complicated when it comes to perhaps building more complex features. But the approach of breaking it one at a time and then fitting it inside of the existing flow of how we've been writing our React and Redux code is going to be definitely the sticking point of why your career as a JavaScript developer, especially with React, will all pay off in the end. Now, up until this point, we've been building new features with our React and Redux flow. But there's a couple things that we can actually move over, and I want to do right now because we want to practice this pattern that we've been writing when building all the things that we've built in the last few lessons. In order for us to figure out what they are, let's take a look back at our application. So there's a couple places right now where we're storing on a component state the things that we can actually move into our Redux. In our home page, we have our directory, if you remember, on our homepage component. On our homepage component, inside of our directory, we keep the sections that we display inside of the state. But this is actually something that perhaps we can move into our store because there's an opportunity for us to possibly move these sections into more than one component. For example, if right now what we're displaying does not maybe work in a mobile view, right? If our application shrinks and we want to display our directory in a way that's more mobile friendly, we can pretty much just pull in the same array and then create a component that displays it in a mobile-friendly way. Another place where we can modify is actually our shop. Right now, we're keeping all of the collection data inside of our shop state. And we do store it inside of the shop data, right, .js, but it is being technically held on the shop component inside of the state. And we can move this out as well because eventually we do want that same data to populate our category pages when we build that. So for example, inside of our collections preview right now, we show the first 4 items in each category. But in the actual category page itself, we want to show all the items. So we want to be able to share that data inside of our Redux state so everything will have access to it. So let's start doing that and get a better practice of our React Redux stuff. The first thing I want to move out is actually what's in our directory component. And for us to do this, we can make a directory Redux folder. So let's close some of this stuff. And inside of our Redux, we will make a new folder called directory. Now, we don't have anything that actually updates these sections, so we don't actually need any actions. We just want a place to store our directory literally as state. So we'll just make a reducer. So we'll do directory.reducer.js. And for our reducer, we are just going to set our initial state first. And our initial state will point to this directory information. And it will pretty much be the default state. Now you might be wondering, is there really a reason for us to move this outside of our directory class component if we're not going to update it, or if we don't currently have another component that's going to pull it in? Well, this is actually where there's a lot of debate about whether or not it's worth it to keep one-time use unmodifiable data inside of a component. Some people say that it's a little bit of overkill to move this data where it's only being used in one place and not being updated into Redux. But there's actually a benefit to doing this that we will not explore until later on in the course inside of our testing section. But one thing that we've largely not talked about is testing. And the reason why is because testing, it's extremely important inside of web development, but it's really important to grasp the fundamentals before we start writing our tests. Because testing and learning about testing really makes sense once you've grasped the fundamentals of what it is that you're writing. Because in a way, testing is its own thing that builds upon the fundamental understanding that you already have. But to the original point, moving our state outside of our component and into their own reducers actually makes it easier to test. But we won't talk about that for now. I just want you to perhaps think about what's to come. But it also sets us up in a way so that in the future, if we do need to use these sections again, we already have the code set up for us. There's no harm in doing it. And it allows our directory component in some ways to be more reusable. So now that we have our directory reducer, let's actually build the reducer code. So I'll say const directory reducer equals this function that takes a state, if we remember, right? Which by default will be the initial state. And then we're also going to have our action. And what we'll say is a switch statement on action.type, but inside we'll just write our default, which is to return state. This is perfectly fine. If we have more actions that might modify the state, we'll bring them in after. But for now, this is good enough. And we'll export out our directory reducer. Now, inside of our root reducer, we got to remember to bring in our new reducer, our directory reducer. From directory reducer. And then let's point to our directory reducer under the directory key. And now, inside of our directory component, we can just simply pull that component, pull the connect in, right? Our higher order connect component from React Redux. And here we will actually write our connect. So because we don't need this local state anymore, we can just render a regular functional component because we don't need access to state. So there's no reason to use a class component. So let's get rid of extra brackets here. And then we'll make sure to pull the sections off of our props that we get in. And then we'll write our map state to props, where we can write our directory selector. So we'll make a new directory.selectors.js. And here we're going to import create selector from reselect. And we're going to make our first selector, which is our directory selector. Select directory equals a function that gets the state and just returns us state.directory. And then we'll actually write our first selector, which will be select directory section, which will be equal to create selector, taking in our select directory, and then outputting directory.section. create selector. So let's bring that into our directory component. It will be from our Redux folder, directory/directory selectors. And we want our select directory sections as well as our create structured selector. Reselect. So it's definitely a lot of files and a lot of moving around and jumping between these files, importing the right libraries, and remembering all these things. It took me a long time to get fully comfortable with being able to just remember all the moving parts as well. But again, practice makes perfect. So we will call create structured selector, passing our sections, our select directory section. And then we will connect our directory with our map state props. And now, double imported. Okay. And now if we look, we see that in our final application, on our home page, our code still works. We have our directory, and we have our sections inside of our state. So it's definitely a lot of files to remember, and even then we're not writing any actions, but even this is still good practice, just to remember all the parts of flowing through, writing a new reducer, attaching it to our state, pulling it into our components. Practice makes perfect. The more practice we have, the better it gets. So now let's do this for our shop before we build our category pages, because we'll definitely need our shop in its own reducer.